Welcome to another human-read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server. Link below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, and the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and communality, which can in turn produce a communist mode of production through the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all of these texts have to say about this, and at the end have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of it, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together, present it as a coherent whole in an educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be the 1945 Nature, Function, and Tactics of the Revolutionary Party of the Working Class. We have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which is also posted in the pinned comment if you prefer to read it in text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version on my Google Docs notes. It'll summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself, for the sake of understanding the context. In addition, in the reading I supply my own commentary, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. So on to the analysis. Principles and actions are in a dialectical relationship and arise together, with tactics and organizational form being the same, and in relation to principles and action in turn. Hence, the basis for action changes, then the tactics and structure must change. However, because the class character society is in place and does not change outside of revolution, that means our principles must not be distorted or revised. Dogmatism thus must be avoided, with its belief that one size fits all for organization, else our tactical actions may have reduced dynamism. At all times, the task of the party is to support individual immediate interests while not harming its own program's basis, which is to be able to carry out the general and final goal: revolution, seizure of political power with the production of the dictatorship of the proletariat which can construct communism. This does not change regardless of change in conditions. Hence, a breach of this results in the party no longer being communist. The tactics, on the other hand, are modified by social forces and are not eternal. We must expect that the, quote, liberties afforded to us by bourgeois states will disappear the moment we start taking action to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, no matter how peacefully. The tactics, therefore, should be prepared to transition to offensive against counteroffensive by the bourgeoisie. They should not compromise the party's character or ability to act as general staff, leading to the final objective. The tactics of the party must, in general, 1. Predict situations and conduct. 2. Be able to be carried out. 3. Be consistent with theory. 4. Be consistent with the political consciousness of those carrying it out. 5. Be consistent with the movement's traditions. 6. Be anticipatable by those within the movement. 7. Center internationalism, as the struggle against imperialism makes it so local tactics can only be aspects of general revolutionary strategy across the world. This allows a party to carry out action without delay and with autonomous units moving without having to await command, as they know what is needed. The ability of the party to produce tactics and carry them out requires that the party remain autonomous with its own revolutionary slogans and activities, which make it fully distinct from any party that is opportunistic or revisionist. Our strategy should be to restore programmatic clarity to the international movement and then rebuild the network of organizations in each country, which requires us rejecting coalition, remaining autonomous, and not under any other movement or a super party, and understand that the proletarian masses through theory, action, and preparation for insurrectionary assault and management of power. With this understanding, the proletariat will understand that the party is the only path forward to defeat capitalism and fascism. And now I will begin to read the audiobook in full. I hope that you enjoy the session and will attend next time as well. Welcome to another reading from the United Marxist Pact. We just finished up the Third Communist International's sixth and large executive report by the left of the Communist Party of Italy. We are skipping quite a few years, all the way to the end of World War II, with 1945's Nature, Function, and Tactics of the Revolutionary Party of the Working Class. So this was in Prometeo number 7, May through June 1947. It seems like that's when it was published. So let's get right into it. In question relating to the tactics of the party is of fundamental importance and will be clarified in relation to the history of the disagreements in tendency and direction which occurred in the Second and Third Internationals. We must not regard the question as being secondary or derivative in nature. In the sense that groups who are in agreement to the doctrine of the program may, without affecting those basics, support and apply different directions in action, albeit with respect to the transient episodes. To pose problems relating to the nature and action of the party, it signifies moving from the field of critical interpretation of social processes to that of the influence, and these processes may exert a force as actively engaged. The transition is the most important and delicate point of the whole Marxist system, and was framed in the youthful sentence of Marx. Quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, end quote, and, quote, the weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism by weapons, end quote. This passage from pure knowledge to active interpretation should be understood according to the dialectical materialist method in a manner totally different from those of followers of traditional ideologies. All too often, it has been useful to the opponents of communism to exploit the Marxist theoretical background in order to sabotage and disavow the consequences of action in battle. That is, from the opposite perspective, to appear to adhere to the practice of the proletarian party while challenging and rejecting its fundamental principles. In all these cases, the deviation was a consequence of anti-classist and counter-revolutionary influences, and expressed itself in crisis as what we shall call, for the sake of brevity, opportunism. Principles and doctrines do not exist in themselves as a foundation arisen and established before action. Both the former and the latter are formed in parallel processes. It is their opposing material interests that in practice impel social groups to fight, and it is out of the action instigated by material interests that the theory which becomes the party's characteristic inheritance is born. If the balance of interests, the incentives to act, and the practical directives for action are changed, then the doctrine of the party is likewise modified and distorted. To think that this doctrine might have become sacred and inviolable due to its codification in a programmatic text and through a strict organizational and disciplinary arrangement of the party organism, and that therefore one may adopt various policies and have recourse to multiple maneuvers in the area of tactical activity, means having to fail to identify, using a Marxist criteria, the real problem that needs to be resolved in order to decide how the methods of tactical action may be selected. Okay. I'll take this. All right. So principles and actions are in dialectical relationship and arise together. Therefore, tactics and therefore organizational form are in dialectical relation with each other, and principles and actions as well. If the basis for action changes, our tactics and structure must change. However, because the class character of society is in place, that means our principles must not be distorted. We need to avoid dogmatism and the belief that one size fits all for organization, or else our tactical actions may have reduced dynamism. I'm glad that they agree. I'm really glad that they agree that we need to have a dynamic organizational structure and that no one size fits all, and that we can, in fact, make concrete declarations about the character of any given organization, and therefore study these things scientifically, since we can actually talk about how these things function. Okay, continuing. We return to the determinist analysis. Do social events unfold through uncontrollable forces giving rise to diverse ideologies, theories, and opinions among men, or can they be modified according to more or less conscious wish of men themselves? This question is dealt with by the proletarian party's own method, with which it radically brushes aside traditional thinking, which always refers to the isolated individual, claiming to resolve the question for the individual and then to deduce from this solution for society as a whole. Whereas, on the contrary, you must move the question from the individual to the collectivity. The quote, collectivity is always understood by other metaphysical abstractions to mean society of all men, whereas in the Marxist sense, we must understand collectivity as a concretely defined group of individuals who, in a given historical situation, have, through their social relations, that is to say, in relation to their position in production in the economy, parallel interests. Groupings are, in fact, called classes. For the many social classes that human history presents, the problem of their ability to understand exactly the process in which they live and to exercise a certain degree of influence over it is not resolved in one and the same generic way. Each historical class has its own party, its own system of opinions and of propaganda. Each one has claimed with some insistence to with the same insistence to interpret the meanings of events precisely, to be able to direct them towards a more or less vague conceived objective. Marxism provides the critique and the explanation for all these approaches and points of view, showing that the various ideological generalizations were a reflection of the conditions and the interests of classes in conflict, expressed through opinion. In this continuous change, whose engines are material interests, whose protagonists are groupings in class parties and governmental organizations, and those outward appearances are political and philosophical schools, the modern proletarian class, once the social condition for its formations have emerged, presents itself with new and superior capabilities, both in terms of its possession of a non-superficial interpretation of historical movement in its entirety, and in terms of the concrete efficacy of its action in social and political struggle, influencing the general unfolding of this movement. This other fundamental concept was set out by Marxists with the classic and notable phrases, quote, with the proletarian revolution, human society emerges from its prehistory, and, quote, the socialist revolution constitutes the passage from the world of necessity to a world of freedom, end quote. It is not, therefore, a matter of asking, in banal traditional terms, the question of whether man is free in his will or determined by the external environment. If a class and its party are conscious of their historic mission and derive from this theoretical consciousness the power to implement it with a view bringing about a general improvement, or are drawn into the struggle, into success or disaster by higher or unknown forces, you must first ask what classes and what parties they are. What are their relations in the field of productive forces and state powers? What is the historical path already taken? And what is the path that, according to the results of critical analysis, remains to be taken? According to the doctrine of religious schools, the cause of events lies outside of man, in God the Creator, who has decided everything and who has also decided to concede the degree of liberty of action to the individual, for which he must therefore answer in the afterlife. It is well known that Marxist social analysis has completely abandoned such a resolution of the problem of the will and of determinism. But also the solution offered by bourgeois philosophy, with its claim to enlightenment critique and its illusion of having eliminated all arbitrary and revealing premises, remains equally misleading, because the problem of action is always reduced to the relation between subject and object, and in the ancient and recent versions of the various idealistic systems of the point of departure is sought in the individual subject, in the quote, I, precisely in which resides the mechanism of his thought, and then which translates excessively in the interventions of this quote, I upon the natural and social environment. From this comes the political and legal lie of the bourgeois system, according to which man is free and, as a citizen, has the right to govern the common weal according to the opinion born inside his head, and therefore also his own interests. If it has thus thrown out all transcendent influence in every divine revelation, the Marxist interpretation of history and of human action has with no less decisiveness capsized the bourgeois schema of liberty an individual will, showing that as the individual's needs and interests that explain his movement and action, and that his opinions and beliefs and what is called his consciousness are only determined as the final effect of the most complicated influences. Indeed, it is when we pass from the metaphysical concept of consciousness and the will of the quote I to the real and scientific concept of theoretical consciousness and the historical and political action of the class party that the problem is clearly posed and we can address the solution. So, I don't strictly disagree, but here's my response to that, right? Marx is Marx starts from a humanist principle, and it's true that to some degree he trends over into a post-humanist critique of humanism, but it's only to reinforce humanism in its own right. And Marx does not say that individuals don't exist or anything like that. In addition, it's not like one can only develop consciousness within the political class party. That's to say, proletarian class consciousness within the political class party. That doesn't make sense because Marx is talking about the development of proletarian consciousness far before that. And and this is just a little confusing to me because ultimately what Marx is aiming for is the full liberation of the individual human in and through human society, right? Which involves the complete liberation of every single individual because if one person is enslaved, then everybody is enslaved. If one person is exploited, everybody's exploited. And you know, the end of alienation, the end of the external agent, which mediates relations and so on and so forth, involves human society as a whole and the individuals within it, in and through that society, making all decisions themselves directly, being able to say, this is what's going to happen according to my will. So I don't think that you can simply say, oh, the I doesn't exist, or that Marx goes in and rejects the I. In fact, quite the opposite. I think that you can absolutely come to an egoistic, you can come to communism through pure egoism. You don't need to let yourself be subsumed by the mass or whatever here. And if they're not saying that in this text, then that's fine. But it certainly seems like they're positing that because they're not presenting this alternate understanding. They're rejecting the will of the individual when in reality the will of the individual is in fact a key portion of Marx. Marx isn't saying everybody should subsume themselves. It's that everything subsumes itself to everything all at once and is liberated in the process. The individual becomes truly individual in such a condition. Whereas currently, we're certainly not individual. We're part of a class. The aim is to end classes, not create and reinforce new ones. Still, this is talking about the political class party, and the party, of course, should dissolve at the end of the state. So maybe I'm jumping the gun there. Anyway, continuing. Dissolution has an original repercussion for the movement of the party of the modern proletariat, in that for the first time a social class appears that which is not only driven to break up old systems and old political and legal forms that impede the development of productive forces, a revolutionary task which preceding classes also had, but for the first time carries out its struggle not in order to set up a new dominant class, but to establish productive relations that allow for the elimination of economic pressure and the exploitation of one class by another. Therefore, the proletariat has at its disposal superior historical clarity and in directing society, exercises more direct influence over events than the classes that precede it ever could exercise. We're going to add this to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Dictator proletariat. And we're going to put this. All right, continuing. This historical attitude and new faculty of the class party of the proletariat should be followed through the complex process of its manifestation in the sequence of historical events that the proletarian movement has encountered to date. The revision of the Second International, which gave room for opportunism through the collaboration with bourgeois governments in both war and peace, was the manifestation of the influence that the peaceful and apparently progressive phase of bourgeois world had set the proletariat towards the end of the 19th century. At the time, it seemed that the expansion of capitalism was not leading, as had been set out in Marx's classic schema, to the inexorable aggravation of class antagonisms and of exploitation and proletarian immiseration. It seemed, when the limits of the capitalist world could still be extended without arousing violent crises, that is through imperialism, the extension of the capitalist world, that the standard of living of the working class could gradually improve within the bourgeois system itself. Theoretically, reformism elaborated the scheme of evolution without clashes from a capitalist to a proletarian economy without conflict. Practically, and consistent with the theory, it stated that the proletarian party could exert a positive influence, winning partial advances through the day-to-day trade union, cooperative, administrative, and legislative activity, which would in addition expand the number of nuclei of the future socialist system within the body of the current one, which would gradually transform it in its entirety. This is the evolutionary socialism. Continuing. The idea of the task of the party was no longer that of a movement that would make everything dependent on the preparation of the final effort to attain the final goals, but was transformed into a substantially voluntarist and pragmatic idea. The sense that day-to-day work was presented as a solid and definitive fulfillment, and counterposed against the emptiness of the passive expectation of a great future success that should arise from revolutionary struggle. No less voluntaristic, also for its declared adherence to more recent bourgeois philosophies, was the syndicalist school of thought. Even if it spoke of open class conflict and the removal and abolition of the very bourgeois state mechanism that the reformists wanted to permeate with socialism, in reality, by localizing the struggle and social transformation to individual manufacturing companies, syndicalism also believed that the proletarians would be able to successfully establish lots of victorious positions within islands of the capitalist world. The theory of factory councils put forward by the Italian movement of Ordine Nuovo, in which the international and historical unity of the work class movements and of social transformation is fragmented into a series of positional gains within elements of the productive company in the name of a concrete and analytical preparation for action, was really a derivation of the syndicalist concept. Returning to gradualist revisionism, it is clear that, as the maximum programmatic realizations of the party's action was relegated to a secondary role, while partial and daily conquests were accorded a primary role, so the well-known tactic came to be publicly advocated of alliances and coalitions with groups and political parties that would from time to time consent to supporting the partial demands and reforms put forward by the proletarian party. Even then, there is a substantial objection to this approach, that the alliance of the party with others, in a front which the political world divided into two unspecific issues arising from the actuality of the moment, consequently distorted the party, clouding its theoretical clarity, weakening its organization, and impairing its ability to frame the struggle of the proletarian masses in the revolutionary phase of the conquest of power. And all this stuff is important, and at the very least, I will include it in my notes. It's just that it doesn't really fit in. This historical development and the reasons that, various reformist movements and whatnot crop up is important to take note of. um, in, in the abstract. Uh, Not so much in the concrete. If I'm explaining, it would be useful if somebody asked me, so why shouldn't the party engage in electoralism? I can explain the history behind why we've come to this conclusion, but at the same time, it's not strictly useful for ourselves. Anyway, continuing. The nature of the political struggle is that of alliance of forces in two camps separated by opposing solutions to a unique contingent problem, polarizing all the action of groups around this passing interest and this immediate purpose, and overwhelming any programmatic propaganda and any coherence with traditional principles. Will determine orientations within militant groups that directly reflect and translate the demand for which they are fighting in an unrefined manner. The task of the party, which is apparently a peaceful one to the socialists of the classical epoch, should have been to reconcile its intervention on specific issues and contingent victories with the conservation of its programmatic physiognomy, and its ability to move on the terrain of its own struggle towards the general and final goal of the proletarian class. In effect, reforms practice not only made proletarians forget their class in revolutionary preparation, but led to the very leaders and theoreticians of the movement to get rid of it, proclaiming that there's now no longer the need to worry about maximum objectives, that the final revolutionary crisis predicted by Marxism was now also itself reducing to utopia, and what mattered was daily conquests. The common currency of reformists and syndicalists was, quote, the goal is nothing, the movement is everything. Let's see. We're going to add this. The task of the party is to support the individual immediate interests while not harming its own programs. Basis, which is to be able to carry out the revolution. General and final goal. Revolution, establishment of a DOT, which can construct communism. Okay. 1 second. How's everybody doing today, by the way? There we go. We're starting on this one, right? The role of the party is not to it's to engage in revolutionary defeatism and focus on organizing the working class on revolutionary line. We must expect that the liberties afforded us by bourgeois states will disappear the moment we start taking action to establish a socialist, a dictatorship, the OTP. No matter how peaceful. The okay. I don't know how long it was paused, but I will just reread this real quick. The role of the party is to engage in revolutionary defeatism and to focus on organizing the working class on revolutionary lines. You must expect that the quote-unquote liberties afforded to us by bourgeois states will disappear to military, no matter how peacefully. And that's for pretty obvious reasons. They won't just let us, get the means of production and socialize them. They want to maintain the basis for their existence. No king has ever really actually peacefully just stood down. So, kind of technically, but at the same time, not really. Not in the way that you would think. They converted over to bourgeois. Anyway, continuing. It was a matter in the immediate post-war period when the so-called subjective conditions for revolution seemed unfavorable, that is, the efficiency of proletarians' organizations and political parties. But the objective conditions appeared favorable due to the manifestation of a full-blown crisis in the bourgeois world, of redressing the main shortcoming with a speedy reorganization of the Revolutionary International. That would be the Great Depression, by the way. The process was dominated, and could not have been otherwise, by the magnificent historical accomplishment of the first workers' revolutionary victory in Russia, which had allowed the great communist directives to re-emerge back into the light once more. But they wanted the tactics of the communist parties, which in other countries were a fusion of the socialist groups opposed to war opportunism, to be shaped in a direct imitation of the tactics victoriously applied in Russia by the Bolshevik Party during its seizure of power in the historic struggle of February to November 1917. Implementing this policy immediately prompted important debates about the International's tactical methods, and especially about the one known as the United Front, which consisted of frequently issued invitations to other proletarian and socialist parties for joint agitation and action with the aim of demonstrating the inadequacy of these parties' methods, in order to shift their traditional influence among the masses to the advantage of the communists. Yet, despite the frank warnings of the Italian left and other opposition groups, the leaders of the International didn't take into account of the fact that this tactic of the United Front, by forcing revolutionary organizations alongside the very social democratic, social patriotic, and opportunist ones from which they had just separated, an implacable opposition would not only disorient the masses by making impossible the advantage this tactics is supposed to confer, but also, more seriously still, it would contaminate the revolutionary parties themselves. It is true that the Revolutionary Party is history's best and least restricted factor, but equally, it never ceases to be its product, being subjected to transformation and change every time there's a modification of the social forces. The question of tactics shouldn't be thought of as being like the deliberate wielding of a weapon, which, wherever you aim it, stays the same. The party's tactics influence and modify the party itself. If it is true that no tactic should be condemned in the name of an a priori dogmas, equally every tactic should be analyzed and discussed in light of the question something like this. In possibly gaining for the party greater influence over the masses, might it not risk compromising the party's character and its capacity to lead these masses towards a final objective? Okay, take this. All right. So the party's tactics are modified by social forces and are not eternal. The tactics should not compromise a party's character or its ability to act as general staff, leading to the final objective. Continuing. The adoption of the tactic of the United Front by the Third International showed, in fact, that the Communist International was also on the same road to opportunism that led the Second International to liquidation and defeat. Characteristic of the tactics of opportunism has been the sacrifice of the final total victory to partial and contingent success. The United Front tactic revealed itself to be opportunist too, precisely insofar as it sacrificed the primary, indispensable guarantee of final total victory, the revolutionary capacity of the class party, in favor of contingent actions which had supposedly ensured the proletariat a certain momentary and partial advantages, growth of the party's influence over the masses, and greater proletarian cohesion in the struggle to gradually improve its material conditions and maintain any advantages won. In the circumstances of the post First World War period, which seemed objectively revolutionary, the International's leadership was prompted by their concern, not entirely groundless, that they might be caught unawares and with scant support among the masses when a general European movement, with the potential to take power in some of the great capitalist countries, broke out. So important was the possibility of a rapid breakdown of the capitalist world to the Leninist International that today we can understand how, in the hopes of leading ever greater masses into the struggle for European revolution, they relaxed the admission criteria to admit movements which weren't genuine communist parties, and how they tried, with the flexible tactics of the United Front, to retain contact with the masses who were behind the hierarchy of parties which are oscillating between revolution and conservatism. If the favorable eventuality had actually occurred, its impact on the politics and economy of the first proletarian power in Russia would have been so great it would have allowed for an extremely rapid recovery of the communist movement's national and international organizations. But as it was a less favorable outcome which came about instead, that of capitalism's relative recovery, the revolutionary proletariat had to take up the struggle again and go forward with a movement that had sacrificed its clear political approach and structural and organizational homogeneity and was now exposed to new opportunities to generations. Yet the era that opened the doors of the Third International to a new, more deadly opportunist wave wasn't just a miscalculation about the likelihood of the proletariat becoming revolution. With an air of historical approach and interpretation consistent with wanting to generalize the experiences and methods of Russian Bolshevism by applying them in countries where bourgeois capitalist civilization had progressed much, much further. Russia before February 1917 was still a feudal country in which capitalist productive forces were fettered by antiquated relations of production. In this situation, analogous to France in 1789 and Germany in 1848, it was obvious that the proletarian party needed to fight against Tsarism, even if the establishment of a bourgeois capitalist regime, once Tsarism had been overthrown, seemed impossible to avoid. And it was consequently just as obvious that the Bolshevik Party needed to enter into contact with other political groupings, contacts rendered necessary by the struggle against Tsarism. Between February and October 1917, the Bolshevik Party encountered objective conditions which favored a much more ambitious scheme, that of grafting onto the overthrow of Tsarism a subsequent proletarian revolutionary victory. As a consequence, its tactical positions became more rigid. It adapted a stance of open and ruthless struggle against all the other political formations, ranging from reactionary supporters of Tsar's feudal restoration to the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks. And yet, the fact the real possibility of restoration of absolute and theocratic absolutism was still to be feared, and the fact that in an extremely fluid and unstable situation, the political and state formations controlled or influenced by the bourgeoisie still lacked any solidity or capacity to attract and absorb the autonomous proletarian forces. This put the Bolshevik Party in a position where it could accept the need for provisional contacts and agreements with other organizations which had a proletarian following, as happened during the Kornilov episode. By realizing the United Front against Kornilov, the Bolshevik Party was actually struggling against feudal reactionary restoration. What is more, the Bolsheviks didn't have to worry about the Menshevik and socialist revolutionary organizations being better organized, which might have enabled them to exert influence on the party. Nor was it worried that the level of solidity and consistency of the state power was such as to have allowed the latter to derive any advantage from the contingent alliance of the Bolsheviks by turning it against them later on. The circumstances and relations of forces in countries where bourgeois civilization was more advanced were, however, completely different. In these countries, there is no longer any prospect of a reactionary restoration of feudalism, and even more so today. And therefore, the reason today of for possible joint actions with other parties was entirely lacking. What is more, in these countries, state power and bourgeois groupings were so entrenched in power and so used to wielding it that one could reasonably predict that the proletariat's autonomous organizations, if pushed into frequent and close contact with them via the tactic of the United Front, would almost inevitably be influenced and progressively absorbed by them. Once they had ignored this profound difference of circumstances and chosen to apply the Bolsheviks' tactical methods to advanced countries, tactics which are adapted to the situation of the nascent bourgeois regime in Russia, the Communist International would lurch from one disaster to another, leading eventually to its inglorious liquidation. The tactic of the United Front was extended to the point of launching slogans which diverged from the party's programmatic ones. On the question of the state, by supporting the installation of workers' governments, that is, governments composed of a mixture of communist and social democratic representatives, able to attain power by the normal parliamentary means, without having to violently destroy the bourgeois state machine. This quote unquote workers' government slogan would be presented at the Fifth Congress of the Communist International as a logical and natural corollary of the United Front tactic. It would go on to be applied in Germany, resulting in a grave defeat for the German proletariat and its Communist Party. With the open and progressive degeneration of the International after the Fourth Congress, the watchword of the United Front served to introduce a perverse tactic of forming electoral blocs with parties that were not only non-communist but even non-proletarian, creating popular fronts supporting bourgeois governments. In other words, and this is where the most recent issue arises, of proclaiming that in situations where the bourgeois fascist counteroffensives have attained a monopoly of power, the Workers' Party, suppressing the struggle for its own specific ends, had to form the left wing of an anti-fascist coalition, no longer embracing proletarian parties alone, but also bourgeois and liberal parties, with the objective of combating bourgeois totalitarian regimes and putting in place coalition governments of all the bourgeois and proletarian parties opposed to fascism. This is, by the way, textbook um, the so-called American Communist Party um, giving their votes to Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden to defeat to defeat Donald Trump. Right? It's like, what the hell are you doing? No, we all know exactly what you're doing. Um, you've just completely lost the mark. You're not even your own organization anymore. Anyway, starting with the united front of the proletarian class, we thus arrives at national unity of all the classes, bourgeois and proletarian, dominated and dominated, exploited and exploiting. That is to say, starting from the debatable and contingent tactical movement, having the absolute autonomy of the communist and revolutionary organizations as its declared precondition, we arrive at the effective liquidation of this autonomy and the negation not just of Bolshevik revolutionary intransigence, but also of the Marxist class concept itself. This progressive development, on the one hand, results in a gratuitous contrast with the tactical theses of the First Congress of the International themselves, and the classical solutions supported by Lenin in left wing communism and infantile disorder. And on the other hand, after the experience of 20 plus years of life on the International authorizes the assertion that the enormous deviation from the first aim resulted in parallel with the adverse sequence of events in the anti capitalist revolutionary struggle, from the initially inadequate formulation of the tactical protests of the party. Today, it is possible to conclude, without recalling the totality of key arguments from the texts of the contemporary discussions, that the balance sheet of over-elastic and over-manipulated tactics not only had negative results, it was absolutely ruinous. We'll take this and say tactics that lack that are taken wholesale from one revolutionary moment to entirely different ones don't really work. And any general could tell you that. Right. I don't think that you need to actually even have all this experience before, because instead you could go over and research, you know, any basic military academy, and hear what they have to say about tactics. And I assume that they would say as much. Like the fact that you have different terrains at all, like geographic terrains at all, automatically means that your tactics are going to have to shift in response to things. And I think that if people are really saying that they want to just wholesale copy paste the experiences of Russian Revolution over, and people really went with that, I kind of believe that it might have been the fault of the people, of not the people pushing the idea, but the people carrying that out. Because I simply cannot really imagine that Lenin, of all people, would go in and just say, copy everything that I did exactly the way I did it. That quite specifically goes against everything. He talked about different tactics in regards to the construction of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? He said, hey, look, the Paris Commune doesn't really work this way anymore. Engels talked about the fact that the methods of struggle for the Paris Commune wouldn't work out either. Bringing to attention the way that Paris had been reconstructed, quite literally on a physical level, to make it so the barricades would no longer work. So I just struggle to imagine that anybody would be demanding that everybody just pick up everything exactly the same way. Yes, eh, yes, everybody's saying take the example of the Russian Revolution, learn from it. And hey, look, you need to increase your membership, and this is the way the Russian Revolution did it. And yeah, that's going to impose itself. But I strongly struggle to believe that Moscow was just going around and saying, no, you need to do it one to one. You need to do everything exactly the way we did. Lenin is in full rights to critique the spontaneous aspects of the Dutch and German stuff, their rejection of trade unionism, and so on and so forth. And they're in their full rights to criticize his attacks on them and say, hey, look, our conditions are different. Nobody's saying not to learn from the Russian Revolution. But I might be wrong. Maybe people who are in charge of parties and stuff like that are just completely tactically ignorant and don't understand the fact that different conditions result in different tactical methodologies, even if some tactics rhyme. Um, so I don't know. Anyway, continuing. The Communist parties under the leadership of the Comintern tried repeatedly and all countries to use the situations in a revolutionary way with united front maneuvers, and then oppose all the so-called triumph of the bourgeois right with the tactic of left-wing blocs. This tactic only provoked resounding defeats. From Germany to France to China and Spain, the attempted coalitions not only failed to move the masses away from the opportunist parties and from bourgeois or pay bourgeois influence to revolutionary and communist influence. They favored the success of the inverse game in the interests of anti-communists. Note, the Chinese Revolution was 1949. Um, so this ended up being incorrect in this place. But anyway, continuing. The Communist parties either became the object when the coalitions broke down of ruthless reactionary attacks by their foreign allies, that happened with China, bringing them the heaviest defeats in their attempt to struggle alone. The Chinese Communist Party did survive. It was um, the Long March, and then they essentially had to rebuild, but they did so stronger than ever. Or absorbed into coalitions degenerated totally to the extent that they became practically indistinguishable from the opportunist parties. It is true that between 1928 and 1934, a phase that took place in the Comintern went back to the slogan of autonomous positions and independent struggle, returning all of a sudden to the political and oppositional front against bourgeois leftists and social democratic currents. But this brusque tactical volte-face only produced the most absolute disorientation in the Communist parties and did not offer a single historical success in the annihilation of either the fascist counteroffensive or the joint actions of bourgeois coalitions against the proletariat. The cause of these failures must be traced back to the fact that successive tactical slogans have rained down upon the parties and their structures appearing as unexpected surprises, with the communist organizations caught totally unprepared for the various eventualities. The tactical plans of the party, on the contrary, even if they do predict a variety of situations and conduct, cannot and must not become the esoteric monopoly of leadership circles. They must be strictly coordinated with and consistent with theory and the political consciousness of the militant, with the movement's traditions. They must permeate the organization such as always prepared in advance and able to predict how the party's unitary structure will respond towards favorable and unfavorable events in the course of struggle. To expect more and different things from the party, and to believe that it won't be wrecked by unforeseen blows to its tactical rudder, does not amount to having a fuller and more revolutionary concept of the party, but clearly constitutes, as proven by historical facts, the classical process defined by the term opportunism, which either leads the revolutionary party to disillusion and ruin under the defeated influence of bourgeois politics, or to find itself more vulnerable and disarmed in the face of repression. So we're going to take this. All right. So the tactics of the party must predict situations and conduct, be able to be carried out, be consistent with theory, be consistent with political consciousness of those carrying it out, be consistent with the movement's traditions, and finally be anticipatable by those within the movement, because it's all the above. This allows the party to carry out action without delay and with autonomous units moving without having to await command. Now, Lemonades asks, so what would be solutions to combat revisionism? Since I see it pop up a lot with these texts that party or organization becomes revisionist. The argument that this guy is making is essentially that these things arise because essentially people are just copying each other without any thought, for one. For another, it arises because because people aren't keeping their principles in mind. They are looking for their immediate interests rather than the end goal. Um, this is really opportunism that I'm describing here. Um, Revisionism, more specifically, is the abandonment of core principles of Marxism. For example, the necessity of class struggle. And really, this is a principal thing, right? Because, and more, sorry, let me, let me backtrack a little bit. This opportunism that's being described here leads to revisionism because what's happened here is, that they're describing is, hey, look, they are opportunistically abandoning the final goal and for the immediate and short and medium term goals, right? And they're talking only about the movement, not about where they're trying to get to. And this in turn leads to the development of the United Front, which in turn leads to the development of the uh, whatever that front is, where they ally with bourgeois, left bourgeois parties and whatnot. And then what's the result of that? Ba bing ba boom, you've abandoned class struggle, and you've abandoned all your principles. You're agitating um, for bourgeois parties and stuff like that, giving votes over to bourgeois parties. Um, so yeah, the solution is to not do these things. To keep your principles, to focus on the working class and only with the working class, to struggle again to maintain autonomy um, outside of any other organization and so on. All right, continuing. When the level of development in society and the course of events lead the proletariat to serve ends that are not its own, consisting of the false revolutions which the bourgeoisie now and apparently needs, it is opportunism that wins. The class party falls into crisis, its direction passes over to bourgeois influence, and the recovery of the proletarian path cannot happen except with the split away from the old parties, the formation of new nuclei, and the national and international reconstruction of the proletarian political organization. In conclusion, the tactic that the International Proletarian Party will apply, attaining its reconstruction in all parties, will have to be based on the following directives: the practical experience of communist crises, of opportunist crises and struggles led by left-wing Marxists against the revisionists, the Second International, and against the progressive deviations of the Third International, has shown that you cannot keep the party's program, political tradition, and solidity of organization intact if the party applies a tactic which, even if only formally, entails attitudes and slogans that are acceptable to opportunist political movements. Uh, I guess we'll. Okay, we'll have to take this one at a time. Okay, party must remain autonomous with its own revolutionary slogans and activities, which make it fully distinct from any other party, or any party that is opportunistic and the like. Similarly, every uncertainty and ideological indulgence has its reflection in an opportunist tactic and action. The party therefore differentiates itself from all the others, whether declared enemies or alleged kindred spirits, and even from those who claim to recruit their followers from the ranks of the working class, because its political praxis rejects the maneuvers, alliance, and blocks that are traditionally formed on the basis of postulates and slogans common to several parties. This position has an essentially historical value, which distinguishes it in the tactical domain from all the others, exactly as its original vision of the period that capitalist society is going through. The Revolutionary Class Party is the only one to understand that the economic, social, and political postulates of liberalism and democracy are today anti historical, illusory, and reactionary. The world is now in the phase in which, in the large countries, liberal organization is disappearing and giving way to a more modern fascist system. By contrast, in the period in which the capitalist class has not yet initiated its liberal cycle, has still to overthrow the old feudal power, or even in some important countries, had to go through noble stages and phases of expansion. So laissez faire as regards to economic processes and democratic as regards the state. In cases, a transitory alliance of the communists with those parties was comprehensible and acceptable. In the first case, with parties that were openly revolutionary, anti legalist, and organized for armed struggle, and the second, with parties that still played a role assuring useful and genuinely quote unquote progressive conditions, allow the capitalist regime to speed up the cycle which must lead to its downfall. This change in communist tactics, which corresponds with the passage from one historic period to another, cannot be reduced to a local and national case study, nor become dissipated in the analysis of the complex uncertainties which the historic evolution of capitalism undoubtedly presents, without resulting in the practice deplored by Lenin in one step forward, two steps back. The politics of the proletarian party has, above all, been international, and this distinguishes it from all others, since the program was formulated for the first time and since the historic need for its effective organization rose. As the manifesto states, the communists who support every revolutionary movement everywhere against the existing social and political order put forward and assert, alongside the question of property, the common interests of the entire proletariat, or independent of any nationality. The revolutionary strategy of the communists, until it's corrupted by Stalinism, has inspired an international tactic looking to achieve the breakthrough of the bourgeois front, the country where the best opportunities appear, mobilizing all the resources to this end. Consequently, the tactic of insurrectionary alliances against the old regime ends historically with the great event of the Russian Revolution, which eliminated the last great state and military apparatus of non capitalist character. After this phase, the possibility, even theoretically, of tactical blocks must be formally and centrally denounced by the international revolutionary movement. All right. The party must center internationalism. Continuing. The excessive importance given during the first years in the life of the Third International to the application of the Russian tactic in countries with stable bourgeois regime, as well as to extra-European colonial countries, was a first manifestation of the reemergence of the revisionist peril. The Second Imperialist War, which its already evident consequences are characterized by the preponderant influence extended to all regions of the world, even those where the most backward forms of indigenous society survive, not so much of powerful capitalist economic forms as the inexorable political and military control exercised by the great imperial center of capitalism, were now brought together into a giant coalition which includes the Russian state. Consequently, local tactics can only be aspects of the general revolutionary strategy, which above all must be to restore the programmatic clarity of the global proletarian party and then to rebuild the network of its organization in each country. Okay. So, because this internationalism is necessary, as is therefore the struggle against imperialism, local tactics can only be aspects of general revolutionary strategy across the world. The goal that the strategy is to restore programmatic clarity of the international, not that the international existed at this period, but that's what I'm going to call the Global Proletarian Party. And then rebuild the network of organizations part of that in each country. Continuing. This struggle unfolds within a framework in which the illusions and seductions of opportunism hold sway to the maximum extent. Propaganda in favor of the crusade for liberty against fascism in the ideological domain, and the practical politics of coalitions, blocs, fusions, and illusory demands presented in concert by the leaderships of innumerable parties, groups, and movements. In only one way will it be possible for the proletarian masses to understand the need for the reconstruction of the Revolutionary Party, substantially different from all others. That is, by proclaiming the historically irrevocable repudiation of the practice of agreement between parties, not as a contingent reaction to the opportunist Saturnalia and the acrobatic combination of politicians, but rather as a fundamental and central directive. Or actually, I'll take both of these. So, to do this, we need to propagandize the defeat of fascism and the rejection of coalition with non communist organizations. We must make it clear that the rejection of coalition is a fundamental and central directive, and not something that can be abandoned at a particular time and place. Continuing. Even in transitory phases, none of the movements that the party participates alongside must be directed by a super party or higher movement standing above a group of affiliated parties. Would that be what the international is? Anyway, in the modern historical phase of global politics, the proletarian masses will only be able to mobilize for revolutionary goals by achieving their class unity around a single party that is solid in theory and its action in the preparation for the insurrectionary assault and the management of power. This historical solution must, in any manifestation of the party, even limited, appear to the masses as the only possible alternative to oppose the consolidation in the international economic and political domination of the bourgeoisie and its formidable capacity, not definitive, but today growing ever stronger to control the contradictions and the convulsions that threaten the existence of its regime. We're just going to take these two things here. Party must remain autonomous and not under other movements or a super party. International? Again, I'm not too clear on what this super party they're referencing is. If they mean the international or not, because, the whole point is that the international, even if you're not like directly suborn to the international gets to say what its requirements for entry within it are. And if that isn't having the capacity to direct other organizations, then I don't know what is. Let's see. The party must have the understanding of the proletarian masses through theory, action, preparation for insurrection revolutionary assault, management of power. With this understanding, know that it is the only path forward to defeat capitalism and fascism. And I didn't pause it, but to go quick over, the party must have the understanding of the proletarian masses through theory, action, preparation for insurrectionary assault, and the management of power, I assume, within the party. With this understanding, know that they need to know that it's the only path forward to defeat capitalism and fascism. And that is the nature and function of tactics of the Revolutionary Party of the working class, written in 1945. Next time, we will be reading through the party platform. This is of a similar length, and hopefully it will be as interesting and concise as this previous reading. With that said, have a great day, everybody. UMP signing off.